There was no repentance on both sides. In fact, Saul was presented very specifically with what had to happen, right? And Saul did not allow his jealousy, his bitterness, at first of all giving a pre-battle sacrifice, and then secondly in chapter 15, we saw his second mistake when we looked up his inability to completely wipe out the Amalekites and the consequences that had. And so he wouldn't submit to God's consequences for his poor decisions. He wanted his son to be the king so much that he had jealousy directed towards David. And so even though David submitted, even though David was a good soldier, even though David played well, and he didn't walk in demanding the crown. He didn't say, "All right, Saul, I was anointed king. You're in my seat." No, he didn't say that. He was willing to submit to. In fact, he had a chance to end Saul's life multiple times and chose not to. But this was one-sided. There was no like-mindedness, which is what we're going to see. That there needs to be a change of mind on both sides in order for the establishment of a relationship to go forward. Now, what that relationship is like is really dependent upon the level of like-mindedness that you have. That's what we're going to see. But let's go ahead and take a look at some New Testament examples. We're going to go back and forth. We've got some New Testament and Old Testament examples. Let's go to Philippians. And we're going to see some problems here. Let's pick it up in verse 1. And we're going to see Euodias and Syntyche. I think I have her name spelled incorrectly. Sorry for that typographical error. She has two Y's, not two E's. But Paul says in chapter 4, verse 1, "Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved, and longed for, my joy and crown, stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. I beseech Euodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord." And he continues on, "I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and with other of my fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." Paul calls these individuals fellow laborers, basically workers together. We have fellow laborers. We don't yoke fellow. This idea of fellow, we don't really use that. But this is our Greek preposition soon, which has that intimate connection. So remember the distinction between meta and soon. Meta is, I was on Interstate 10 today with a few hundred of my fellow Floridians. That's meta. I was there with them in traffic, right? But when I got home, I was at home with my wife and daughter. I was there. There was an intimate connection between myself and my family, whereas I'm driving along on the interstate, all I have in common is maybe we're headed the same direction. So this is a soon ergos, workers, fellow laborers. So what makes them, Paul talks about Clement and other fellow laborers in verse 3. What makes them together? What makes their connection intimate? This like-mindedness, this having the mind of Christ. All right? Paul actually talked about it back in chapter 2. What mind are we supposed to have? If I'm supposed to be like-minded, whose mind are we supposed to have? Well, the mind of Christ. And so what was the point of, if I were to take Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 9, and condense it into one statement and describe the mind of Christ, what is that mindset that we're all supposed to have? Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of men. So you're getting the idea? What are we supposed to do? What mindset are we supposed to have? Humility, service, and allowing God to exalt us. All right? Even though I can lay claim to something, I set it aside for something that's more important. Who had everything to lay claim to? Christ did. And he set aside all that he was able to set aside. And basically went from the highest point to the lowest point possible. Took upon the form of a servant. Was made in the likeness of men. So that was a big fall. That was a big humility right there, humiliation. But that wasn't enough. As a man, he became a servant. And that wasn't enough. As a servant, he allowed himself to be executed as the worst criminal. Naked on a cross. So there was no more humiliation that Jesus could stand other than he stood. He had it all. He gave everything up he was able to give. Why? So that God would then highly exalt him. Give him a name which is above every name. That at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. So this is the mindset that you and I are to have. And this is what connects Paul with his yoke fellows. So our yoke fellow is the same. This is co-yoked, a colleague. So again, that soon connection with a colleague. So he uses yoke fellow and fellow laborer in the same verse 3. Let's rewind now to verse 2. What kept Euodias and Syntyche from being in the same connection that Paul had with Clement and his fellow workers and his fellow laborers? What kept them apart? They lacked the same mindset. And he says it. I beseech Euodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. That's all we're told about these ladies. There's some speculation in the commentaries as to why we have one name that has Jewish origin and one name that has kind of Gentile origin here. And so the mindset is that each of these ladies were hosting a church in their home, and one was a group of Gentile believers and one was a group of Jewish believers. And Paul said, these churches need to be together. There's no reason for them to be separate. Okay. Now, what I just said was not sanctified. It wasn't inspired. It is a possibility as to what their problems could have been. We're not told what their problems are, but we are told what their solution is. What is their solution? Be like-minded. And again, have the mindset that Jesus had back in Philippians chapter 2, same book 2 chapters ago. So one of them, if not both of them, needed to have a change of mind so that they could be, and again, I don't think it's an accident what we see in the context. It's not an accident what we see here in verses 3, 4, and 5. I think we can probably assume that their problem had to do in this area of anxiety. This problem had to do in the area of the inability to rejoice, the inability to have the joy of their salvation. The things that we see in the context here, we could apply back to their problem. So whatever the problem between them was, the resolution was like-mindedness, which is again linked to humility. We can take a look at this idea of being like-minded and look at James and look at 1 Peter chapter 3. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. In each of those passages, we see like-mindedness being talked about, but we can see something else in the context. We can see humility. And we can see not thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to think. So let's apply this back to our situation that we talked about last Wednesday with Saul and David. How could this mindset have been helpful in the reconciliation of those two guys?
David already had himself the mindset of a servant. He served Saul, knowing that he had a right to claim his throne. Saul, on the other hand, we see is full of pride and self-importance.
So what would it have taken from Saul, Patrick?
I think they both need to realize they were there to serve Israel as God had directed them. And if they both had been concerned about God's people, then that pride would have went away.
Think of the situations these guys found themselves in during that time period. right? When they should have been standing against the Philistines and protecting God's people. Remember one time when David found himself looking from this side to this side and seeing God's enemies and God's people on the other side. That's when David had to act the crazy man to get out of there. Remember that situation? He's like, okay, maybe I can't be standing there, but I definitely shouldn't be standing here. And so he wasn't thinking about serving God's people. He was thinking about saving his own skin. And he found himself cavorting with God's enemies, taking a stand with God's enemies. So a time when David probably was not spirit-filled the way he should have been at that moment. And we obviously know Saul had a problem. Saul's problem was an unwillingness to accept God's consequences for his poor choices. In fact, we saw multiple times, Saul was unwilling to admit he'd made poor choices. Saul was unwilling to admit that he made a bad call, right? He walked up to Samuel and said, "Blessed be you of the Lord. I've done exactly what I've been told to do." And Samuel had to say, "What's this bleating of sheep I hear? And why is Agag still breathing breath? Give me a sword. I'm going to fix that." And he hewed Agag to pieces, right? So we have a problem. And so if you were to take this mindset of setting yourself aside, and for Saul to realize, okay, who was it that told Samuel to anoint David king? Well, that's Jehovah. I'm going to submit to Jehovah. I'm going to place myself willingly. I'm not going to think more highly of myself than I ought to think. In fact, he'd already made some bad choices. If we go back and take a look at how God talked to Saul, Saul could have established his kingdom forever. It was very short-lived because of Saul's bad choices. And he said, "It repenteth me that I have made you king. I've taken the kingdom away from you and I've given it to your neighbor." So we see again this principle of, in order to have, and this is possible, again, verse 3, this connection is possible. Paul talks about having a fellow colleague, being intimate together, being of the same mind, fellow yoked, right? You and I are in the same yoke. There's definitely a picture there. If you're going to put two people in a, who's our farmers? Anybody grow up on a farm? Anybody ever put an animal in a yoke? Did you ever have to put an animal, or was it a mechanized farm? I don't know.
You had horses, yes.
Okay, so so you ever have a problem where they're not working together?
Yeah, that's easily correct.
With the prod or a whip, smacking them. So we're going to make them have the right mindset, right? We're going to get all individuality out of there. We're going to make you work as a team, right? And that's what they call horses pulling a wagon. They call them a team of horses, right? A team of horses. And so if you're not working together as a team, if you're not fellow yoked, if you're not connected, then we're going to have a problem. And so there needs to definitely be a connection there. All right, let's take a look at, go to Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45. So there's a little bit of backstory here. We're picking this up way late in the story, right? Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is one of those individuals that we don't see overtly sinning in Scripture. We don't see an example of Joseph making, maybe he was a little naive, maybe he shared some dreams with his brothers that it may not have been wise to share in his youth and naivety, right? But we don't see any overt sin from Joseph. God was with him along each step of the way here. But fast forward to Genesis chapter 45, what's going on here? So Joseph, at this point, has kind of been in front of his brothers multiple times. And he has tested them. And they have responded poorly or well in his tests. Remember what his tests were? Hide my cup in Benjamin's bag. Say I have to have Benjamin here. And how did his brothers respond? How did Judah and Simeon respond? They responded well, right? They were willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the family. In fact, one of the brothers said, I'll stay with you. I'll stay with you as your hostage when they go back. And then they ran out of food again and they had to come and they said, well, if we don't go, and if we don't bring Benjamin, he's not going to give us food, and he's not going to release the brother that stayed back as a hostage. Self-sacrifice. That's something that was not present back when Joseph, right? In fact, they were willing to kill Joseph because he was an irritant. But they've obviously learned this lesson, right? Through the course of, the time escapes me, it was about 20, is it 20 years? No, we have at least 14. So, I don't know, he was in jail for 2 years. So it's been a while. It's been at least 10 years or more. And so, after being sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph rises to power in Egypt, and now he's face to face with his brothers. How are things going to go? Well, let's pick it up. Verse 1. Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, "Cause every man to go out from me," and there stood no man with him. And while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren, he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. Joseph said, "I'm Joseph. Does my father yet live?" And their response at the end of verse 3 was they were freaked out. They were troubled at his presence. They're seeing a ghost right in front of their eyes. And he says, "Come near." Verse 4, "Don't be grieved." Verse 5, this shows Joseph's heart, right? Verse 5, "Don't be grieved, don't be angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither. God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and there are yet 5 years in which there shall be neither earing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." So as far as Joseph's concerned, there's no change of mind necessary. Is Joseph looking to get vengeance on his brothers for what's happened? No, Joseph's perspective is already correct. It's already exactly where it needs to be. Joseph has the right mindset. So in order for reconciliation to take place, we just got to have the brothers fall in line here. And so we see in verse 9, "Haste ye, go up to my father. Thou shalt dwell in the land. I will nourish you." I want to see, "Behold, your eyes shall see in the eyes of my brother Benjamin that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. Tell my father everything that's happened." Verse 13. "He fell on his brother Benjamin's neck, wept. Benjamin wept on his neck. The story went out. Everything's good." And so, verse 21, "The children of Israel did so. Joseph gave them wagons, according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provision for the way. And to his father he sent after this manner." He sent all these gifts. And in verse 26, "They told him, saying, The brothers finally come to Jacob. Joseph is yet alive. He is governor over all the land of Egypt. Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not." And he finally comes up. And so in the next chapter, Joseph brings everybody up. Jacob comes up from Beersheba, verse 5. They jump in the wagons. And we have all the extended family listed here. But what happens, I think we have to go to, I think, is it chapter 50?
I think so.
Verse 17, or 15, chapter 50.
Yes, that's our famous verse here, God's purposes. So Jacob's now dead, right? And Jacob has been buried. And Joseph comes back to Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father, for he had buried his father. Now, verse 15, Jacob's out of the way. Our brothers are freaking out again. They think, okay, we're going to get it now. Verse 15, "When Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him." And so they try to foster a relationship that's not based upon truth. They conjure up this story. Before he died, Jacob said, "You had to be nice to us." Right? They try to create. And verse 19, Joseph says, "Hey, there's no need to play these games. Everything is as it should be." Joseph had to assure them that he did not hold a grudge. Joseph had to assure them that everything was fine. Again, verse 20 is our famous verse here. He says, "Fear not, for I am in the place of God, but as for you, You thought evil against me, but God meant it good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Joseph tells them the same thing he told them 5 chapters ago. He hasn't changed his mindset. And so I think the brothers are just happy that they're able to live. But there was a change of mind. What was their change of mind? This was in Joseph's test. Multiple tests. I always got hung up on that. Why is Joseph having a little fun at their expense? Is Joseph just happy that he's kind of freaking them out a little bit? No, he's testing the brothers. He's testing to see, are you still worried about yourself? Or are you worried about the way Dad is going to think about all this? And so he tests them. He puts a little pressure on them, and the brothers respond the right way. They show that it's not all about them. It's not all about their safety, that they were willing to sacrifice their own freedom and, in fact, their own life to try to make sure that the family had enough grain that the family could survive. So we see Joseph and his brothers. Reconciliation was made possible because we had a change of mind on both sides. We had repentance. Any comments, any questions on that situation? Patrick?
I think, the brothers didn't have animosity towards him. I don't know that the relationship, and maybe it happened after this point that we just read, but I'm just assuming that they had this abiding fear throughout their time in Egypt that Joseph would still seek some kind of revenge. That's not going to make the relationship the best that it could be.
So whose fault was that?
The brother.
It was theirs. So they basically sacrificed what could have been a better relationship by walking on eggshells and by not trusting Joseph's word. So there's a lesson there, I think, too. How many times do we, because of our suspicion, because of our lack of trust, because our lack of faith, our lack of willingness to make ourselves vulnerable, we don't have the richness of a relationship that's possible. We're kind of holding in the back of our mind, I don't think you've changed. I don't think you're really sorry. I don't think you're... And so these are dark clouds that can hang over a relationship. In chapel this morning, I spoke on Ruth's 2 mother-in-laws. Family portrait, right? We talked about Naomi and Rahab, the 2 mother-in-laws to Ruth, and how important it is for why was Boaz the way he was. Well, he was raised by a woman who understood what it was like to have an Israelite for a husband and her be a Canaanite and to have kids. Boaz was raised in a family that understood what it was like to have 2 ethnicities. So he recognized Ruth, and he treated Ruth not as a Moabitess, but he treated her as somebody who was someone who was taking care of their mother-in-law, someone who had declared faith in God. Boaz treated her not because of the way she looked, not because of what he suspected about her, but Boaz treated Ruth because he was trained by Rahab to treat people based upon their actions, not based upon what he was told about them. And so I think that trust could have given the brothers a rich relationship, but they were held back because of their suspicions. So don't allow your suspicions and don't allow your worries and your anxiety to keep you from having a rich relationship that they could have had. Again, they cost themselves a few years of unrest. All right, let's jump to Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau, the last time they had seen each other was when, so if we go to Genesis chapter 33, we have a reuniting of Jacob and Esau. The last time Jacob and Esau were together, Esau wanted to kill Jacob, because what had Jacob just done? He stole the blessing after he had bought the birthright. So he bought the birthright fair and square with a bowl of porridge, right? A bowl of lentils. But he stole right out from underneath him the blessing by dressing up as Esau and lying to Isaac, right? And making venison and the whole deal that mom helped him kind of get it out from under dad, right? And so now after Jacob has been away 20 years, right? 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel, another 6 or 7 years for livestock. Now he's got all this entourage, and he's coming back and he's about to meet up with Esau. And Jacob needs to have a change of mind. So the night before he meets Esau, what happens? Well, chapter 32. Chapter 32, where God wrestles with him, or actually Peniel was, is that 32 or 31? 32. Yeah, it's 32, that's what I thought. And so Jacob actually, in chapter 32, he kind of stacks everybody, right? He puts he puts his least loved family at the front, right? And then this group, and he keeps his favorite wife and his favorite kids back closer to him. Just shows that dysfunctional family, right? That Jacob has of playing favorites, right? With all the wives and the handmaids and everything that happened. But who changes Jacob's mind? Jehovah does. And so God meets Jacob at Peniel and they wrestle. And God says, you are a prince with God. You need to have your mind changed. No longer do you need to hide behind your family. And so the next day, in chapter 33, Jacob lifted up his eyes, looked, and behold, Esau came. He basically divides everybody, but look at verse 3. And he passed over before them. So there's Jacob's like, okay, I'm going to face whatever's coming. I'm not going to try to hide from it. Right? His mindset before was, if he attacks Leah, or if he attacks the handmaids and the kids I don't really like a lot, I can still escape with Rachel, right? I can still get out of here. But he changed his mind after he met with God, and he said, nope, it's time to have a face-to-face with my brother. It's time to get to the bottom of this and take care of it. And so he passes over before them, and Esau had also had a change of mind. What were Esau's last words regarding Jacob that we read? Next time I see him, I'm going to kill him. It's over. But he's also had a change of mind, and we see in verse 4, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck, kissed him, and they wept. And he says, who are all these with thee? And Jacob says, they're my family, right? Everybody comes near, everybody bows themselves. He talks about the gift. Verse 9, he says, I don't even need your gift. I have enough. And Jacob says, no, take the gift, take my blessing, verse 11, that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. And he says, so we've got a reconciliation that's possible here. Now Esau, I don't think he was some believer, right? Esau still got issues, and in fact, if you look at Esau, he's not spoken of well in the New Testament. But this reconciliation between these two guys was able to take place because we simply had a change of mind. They were like-minded and they became family. They were willing to put aside old issues, old problems, and it just wasn't as important as it was at one time. And so are you willing to do this with other family members, with other friends? Things that were super important to you at one time. You ever gotten to that point where you're like, yeah, I don't even know what we fought about. Oh yeah, now I remember. Now I remember, right? Does it still have that same effect in the pit of your stomach? Are you able to just say, no, that's not a big deal to me anymore. I've matured. I've grown past that. And if you can't, you're probably not going to have a very good relationship going forward. But if you can drop it, if you can leave that in God's hands, if you can just have the relationship and not let the old anxieties that hung over you like a cloud bother you, then you'll probably have a good relationship with someone. And you'll probably have new problems. That's the way relationships go, right? You'll have new opportunities to fight. But are you willing to let old things go and have a change of mind? Well, Jacob and Esau had that. Anybody want to add to our conversation of Jacob and Esau? It's kind of an easy one.
I can't help but think that if Jacob had behaved honorably, we would never have had the 12 tribes of Israel.
He got some bad advice, and he did behave pretty poorly, right?
Yeah, well, look what resulted.
Yep. Honorably would have been, hey, I'm not touching your handmaids. I'm not getting involved in this.
Esau would have got the blessing.
All right. So, I mean, what do we learn from there?
God uses us, good or bad,
Yes.
in the circumstance.
I think no more than those patriarchs, right? They were, as Dan described them, they were scoundrels. They were rough guys. Abraham, multiple times, making bad decisions, right? But God showed what he could do with some scoundrels. God showed what he can do with broken things. Think of the story that we talked about before. Ruth the Moabitess, Rahab the harlot, both in the line of Christ, right? Go through that passage in Matthew. Every time they name a mom, there was a story. There was a story of man's failure, man's infirmities, but God's sovereignty over the control of that. And I think that tells that same story of what you're saying. God uses us oftentimes, more often than not, he uses us in spite of ourselves than he does. Dennis?
We see too where back in Genesis 25, God said the older or the younger should serve the older. And it kind of shows when we try to help God out, instead of living in his timing, they didn't need all the area hands and the deer stew, all of this to be good. Sometimes we try to hop in and help God.
Yep.
And make a big mess out of it. That's what we see.
Rebecca started off so well, right? And ended up with a real lack of faith later on in her life. And God just doesn't need us to play those games. God doesn't need us to do that. I was having a good conversation today with a brother of mine who was trying to explain this idea of how to take God's blessing to Abraham in this current day with Israel. Israel is not, while still being God's chosen people. Here was the question. I'm finding it really hard to bless Israel right now. Well, God doesn't need us to bless Israel's bad behavior. That's not what he ever called us to do. Those things that he said about them that are true, that he's not done with them, that one day they will all be saved after being brought through the fire. The advantages that we see in Romans, that to them is given the fathers, to them is given the oracles of God, to them was given the law. These are things that we can say good about Israel. You don't have to say all the things that are coming out in the Epstein files about Israel and the mess that they're in and the underhanded dealings that they've done and spying this and doing. You don't have to support that. God never asked you to bless sin. God didn't ask you to, well, if Israel's name pops up there, God's chosen people, I got to back them up all the way. That's not, they are a nation that has abandoned God, and God is letting them get punished with the Gentiles. But he's not done with them yet. The story is going to be about God's faithfulness. The story is going to be about how God brought them back to repentance. Not, I gotta wave Israel's flag all the time and be pro-Israel. Okay, be pro-Israel, but don't be pro-sin. Don't try to pat them on the back for the bad choices that they're making right now. All right. So we got 3 more. We can take a look at these. Can I have one more week, brother? Dan's got he's ready to go into our next study, but I want to make sure we're going to see the prodigal son. We're going to see Paul's reconciliation with the church, and then I think it'll be a sweet closing looking at Philemon and Onesimus. Any comments, any questions about this idea of reconciliation with others? Hopefully, some of these principles are meeting you where you're at, because I know that this study, we all have issues of reconciliation. We all have believers that we're not getting along with the way that we should. We have things that are interfering with our relationship. We just need to make sure that the problem is not lying with us, that we've made efforts to seek reconciliation, and that we're putting on display like-minded humility. Did I see a hand? I did. Oh, Martin.
I just love that God's able to redeem like Rahab or Ruth, Moabite. If they would seek His face and turn to Him, God's able to redeem even those people that are basically cursed people. And you see that in the Old Testament. God is there to anybody who calls upon Him, there to redeem them if they will trust in Him.
That path is there. We've been reconciled to God because of the crosswork of Christ. The path has been laid